Okay, welcome to the AWS user group for Brisbane for February. It's been a while since drinks. In fact, it's been precisely a month. Last month we spoke about AWS reInvent Recap. This month we've got a couple of interesting talks. But first, we would like to begin by acknowledging the Yugara people, traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal land and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Who am I? I'm Alan Blockley. I'm a domain specialist at ThoughtWorks. I'm also an AWS ambassador and a community builder. I'm also one of the user group leads here today. Alongside Ryan over at the back there, and Clara, who's also over the back there hiding, and Lucy, who's sleeping in because she was on call last night. There's a few people who feel that pain in this room, I feel. Today we have Stefan Knight talking about creating a tech startup 101. Stefan's got a lot of experience in startups, former Amazonian as well, so don't hold that against him, but he's got a lot of really important and cool things to talk about startups today. And then at the last minute, we've got Mark stepping up to talk about SaaS pitfalls. Don't do that. So Mark will be looking after that talk a little bit later, as well as doing the what's new, I believe, as well. Just before we get started, I want to talk about a few upcoming events in the community across Brisbane. Brisbane Serverless just had theirs 2 days ago. I know how inconvenient of them. They could have changed the date. But they have theirs every 3 months, so if you're interested in all things serverless, there's a second meetup similar. Just look at meetup.com and search for Brisbane Serverless Meetup. Actually, Michael here did an absolutely great talk this week all about generative AI, vision, video things in exercising and weightlifting. It was brilliant. Then we've got the Gold Coast user group, which is roughly every 2 to 3 months. Again, on meetup.com, just search Gold Coast user group, or reach out to Demetrio, wherever he is over there, if you want to know more about the Gold Coast user group. And then we've got the Brisbane Data Engineering Meetup, run by Peter Hansen, one of the AWS heroes. That's scheduled for February the 27th. Again, meetup.com, and then look for Brisbane Data Engineering. And then the big one, AWS Community Day Australia. So this one's scheduled at the moment for August this year. The exact date is yet to be pinpointed, pending venue availability. This is an event put on by the community for the community. It's a day of education. It's a day of ultimately coming together and celebrating what it is that we do as a community, sharing knowledge, and being part of the AWS community in general. See if call for papers will start roughly in March to April time. Sponsorships open on Monday. Which city is it in? That's a great question, Mark. I really love it when people ask the questions of the information that I miss. It will be held in Brisbane. Thank you. That's right. Forget Sydney, forget Melbourne. Brisbane's where it's at. We've got the Olympics. We've got Community Day. Cool. And then also new feature for our community. We are going to start looking at bringing you all together. We know how hard it is to try and find the right job at the right time. So we want to know that if you work for a partner and you've got open roles, we want you to post them on our Slack workspace under the channel Jobs. We will then bring them to this screen every month to make sure that we can connect with each other and make sure that we can promote career progression together. If you are interested, please let us know, but ultimately make sure you join our Slack group, QR code coming up at the end of the night, stick around for that, and post into Jobs. All right, I'll shut up now. I'll get Stefan on stage instead.
Hey everybody, good to see you. Last time I was in this room was actually 2 years ago. I was working in the AWS startup team, and Alan was helping us run a security workshop. So it's great to be back in this capacity. I've known Ryan, I've known Alan, actually known Mark for a number of years, even before I came to AWS. It's great to be back, and I really appreciate you extending me the invitation to come chat. So I'm going to talk about tech startups. Kind of a 101 kind of thing. So apologies if it's, If some of you are already steeped in the whole legendary world of mythical tech startups, it's something that I've been doing since the early 90s, and we'll kind of go through that. And I want to make it like accessible, this idea of doing a tech startup, right? We all know about tech startups. We all know the stories of Google and Facebook, and more locally, SwiftX and GoOne and all of that. The thing about it is, it really is an accessible pathway, and we'll kind of talk about that. And that's why I joined Antler, which is a venture capital company, about a year ago, to bring the accessibility of starting a tech startup to people. Commercial co-founders, technical co-founders. So we'll get into that. So how do you start a startup in Australia? Firstly, who am I? Where am I coming from? Do I have any right to play in even talking about this? You might be able to tell by your accent, I'm not an original Queenslander. I come from the States, and I joined the first startup that I was in the early 90s. I'm a pre-internet startup guy. So then I went through kind of the internet transition, got into broadband, telecommunications, worked in, I was the fourth employee in a startup that eventually we went public. We were worth $5 billion, which is really great at the time. Then the stock market crashed and wiped out 90% of all tech stocks. So lots of really interesting experiences over the years. I've worked with startups that have been bought by companies. I worked with a startup where I was leading their partnerships and business development, and we were doing fiber to the home, and we were acquired by Ericsson. So I was involved with some of the first fiber to the home projects globally in Singapore and China and other places. My roles, I actually started off in engineering. So I started off in software, and then I went to the dark side over time. So I got into product management, so a little bit closer to the customer. Then I got into product marketing, was telling stories about the products we were building. Then I got into partnerships and business development, even closer to the sales team. And eventually I thought, well, I could do that even better than they can. So I became a chief revenue officer of a SaaS company called Gorilla Stack. Actually, that's where I first met Rian and Mark across the years. So involved like pre-internet, internet, telecommunications, then got into cloud and SaaS, over time. Last year, I joined Antler, and we'll talk a little bit about what Antler is all about. It's a venture capital company, and frankly, I never wanted to be a venture or vulture capitalist, never wanted to be a vulture capitalist. I always find it really kind of boring. They don't really invest very much. At Antler, we invested about, last year we invested in 25 companies. We helped build and invest in 25 companies. It's really active, really kind of an active group. So we're a little bit different. So we'll talk about investment and VC and stuff like that, and go through some of those terms, demystify it. So Antler, first of all, we're not the luggage company. I mean, I'm sure that's the first thing that comes to mind, because when you Google it, Antler comes up. I actually saw somebody with an Antler bag for the first time ever on the road the other day. Like, wow. I went up to him like, look, I have the t-shirt, you have the bag, there must be some sort of connection here. But there is no connection at all. I actually got started in Singapore about 7 years ago as a venture capital firm. It's now in 16 countries. It's deployed more than $1 billion worth of investment. And our model is a little bit different. We actually help build startups. And we actually kind of recruit solo founders. Has anybody in the room seen a really weird LinkedIn message about a startup founder CTO or startup founder CEO role? Has anybody seen that? Oh man, I really got to start stalking all of you. So we actually go out on LinkedIn and we try to find people with interesting backgrounds. And if somebody has an AWS background, either at AWS or in another startup, or has cloud skills, usually I'm lurking there, tapping you on the shoulder, saying, hey, have you ever thought about starting a tech startup? And you're like, yeah, that sounds good. I always wanted to control my own destiny. I want to tell the man to go shove it. I want to do my own thing. I want to, go for the gold. And so then we recruit these people, and twice a year, we bring them together as a cohort. We bring commercial people, so people with amazing selling skills, go-to-market strategy skills, and then technical folks, cloud skills, ML skills, AI, that type of thing. We bring them in, and we start working on business ideas together. They become founders, we invest in them, and then we keep investing in them. And we'll talk a little bit about these investment terms. I won't assume that everybody knows what pre-seed and A and B and C and all that means. So just like any good sales team, Like when I was at AWS in the startup team, we were supporting startups, but we would want to go find leads. So we actually use LinkedIn to fill our top of funnel, to generate leads of founders, perhaps people like you in the audience, and we do that. And it's been running in Australia for 6 years, and we've built 150 companies so far. And some of those companies from the early years are doing really well now. Okay, so what is a tech startup? Let's just get our terms straight first. Has anybody heard of the gentleman Steve Blank and a book that he wrote called The Startup Owner's Manual? Anybody heard of that one? Andrew's heard of that, it's great. Hey, when I want to do something, I try to go find a manual, right? I try to research, right? I just like rock up, like, what do I do? Please tell me. So I found this a number of years ago. This guy was teaching entrepreneurship at the Berkeley Engineering School. So he wrote The Startup Owner's Manual. And he has a definition for a startup. A startup is an organization formed to search for a repeatable, scalable business model. Notice he didn't say that it's a business. Really, day zero, when you're starting a tech startup, you have an idea, you have a hypothesis, you want to test that hypothesis, and you want to figure out how to make money, based on the idea that you have the solution that you want to bring to market. It really isn't a business yet. It's not really, you may incorporate because you have to, but it's not really a company. You shouldn't really have a board of directors. It doesn't function like an ASX listed company. And your job is to go out and validate this premise that you have for this new business model that you can stand up. A great example would be someone like Airbnb, right? So you have hotels and rooms and all of that, and they had this insight. There's a lot of spare capacity, and people's homes, in essence, were spare capacity, latent capacity. What if we created a marketplace for that? They went out and tested that. And in the early days, you wouldn't have thought that they were all that successful because they were selling cereal, actually, in order to make some money, in order to bootstrap that business. But then later on, they proved it in, they achieved what we would call product market fit and scaled that business. Similar story you could tell around Uber. They had this idea that actually people could drive around and not just taxis and get paid for it. Pretty crazy idea, day zero, and it took them a number of years to prove that in and build that up. Okay, cool. Another good book you probably all heard, because Eric Ries is way more famous than Steve Blank, is The Lean Startup. A pretty good book. It came out a little bit after Steve Blank. And basically, Ries was a head of product in a startup and suffered the inability to achieve product market fit, and then really studied that in detail to come up with some guidelines to help all startup founders figure out how not to fall over and go out of business. All right, so it's not really a business, it's just an idea, and we're gonna go prove an idea. What isn't a tech startup? So as a venture capital company, if you were to come pitch to me opening a cafe, that wouldn't be a startup. Consulting businesses with billable hours, you might call it a startup, but it's not really a tech startup because that's hard to scale. We like software, we like hardware, we like science. We like products that you build that can make you money while you sleep, rather than products that you build that have to be delivered in billable hours. Many consumer businesses wouldn't necessarily qualify for venture capital as well. And things like resources, mining, consumables aren't things that a venture capital company would look at. Okay, so you talked a little bit about venture capital. When is a tech startup venture capital backable? So we probably all have some idea of like venture capital and heard stories, and maybe anybody watched the TV show Silicon Valley? Man, I can't even watch that. It's like I have PTSD when I watch that. I've had so many experiences over the years in Silicon Valley that are mirrored in that show that take me back to some of the worst moments in my life. So can't even watch that show. So you probably have an idea what a VC is. So venture capital is a real niche, actually. We're looking for businesses that we think could skyrocket to $100 million in revenue in 5 years, and within a 10-year period, exit either an IPO or a trade sale, or be able to offer some shares in what's called a secondary to return a market capitalization of at least $1 billion for that company. So the 100 million in revenue times 10, $1 billion. I love good old round numbers in math. And so we would call that hyperscale business. And you're scaling with the tech, the product. You are scaling with people, like maybe salespeople, customer support people, but again, it's not like like you're selling billable services. Like a legal firm or an accounting firm really runs based on selling time. A tech startup runs based on selling a product. So venture capital and tech startup kind of classically go hand in hand. The term venture capital comes into general use in about 1976, and the first, startups really, you could argue startup, goes back a little bit further to early HP and things like that, but they kind of go hand in hand. So think of like Canva and Safety Culture. Safety Culture just raised a monster round last year, $750 million to fuel their growth. Uber, over the course of its startup years before it went public, raised $8 billion. I just imagine somebody with a giant shovel shoveling money into a furnace into Uber to fuel that thing. $8 billion is astounding. To give you an idea, $40 billion in total was invested through venture capital in Australia last year. So the total quantum of $40 billion. Okay, so I think we covered all that. And it's also VC backable if a VC believes it's backable. VCs all have different theses and how they invest. They all have a spreadsheet that they think is kind of the golden rule on how they'll invest and what their rate of return will be and all of that. And in reality, they're making an educated guess. They're not the oracle of understanding what's actually going to take off. So some of them do invest in consumer goods and spend oodles and oodles of money trying to get consumer goods companies off the ground. So if a VC actually believes in it, then you could qualify to call it VC backable. Again, I like research. There's a tremendous book written on venture capital called Venture Deals. It's written by Brad Feld. Brad Feld himself came out of MIT, was a tech founder. He founded a VC firm called Foundry in Boulder, Colorado, and then he co-founded Techstars, which is arguably the number one. Everybody kind of knows Y Combinator, but Techstars is in multiple countries and kind of like bigger. Interestingly enough, this last year we were recognized as the venture capital firm investing in the most pre-seed companies annually, globally, because we're doing 25 in Australia every year. Like almost no other fund no other fund in Australia is investing in that number of companies. The closest would be Scalata. They did 21 last year. So let's unpack some of this terminology because it can all get confusing. You go to these startup events and people are just zinging these terms all over the place and they just assume everybody knows what it's all about. Let's say you start a company tomorrow. Maybe you're a commercial person. You buddy up with a great technical co-founder that's sitting in this room here today, and you have an idea. You're going to build some software or maybe a SaaS company. You put your own money in, and hopefully you can start selling, this minimum viable product or early product to some customers. And hopefully the revenue that comes in is profitable, because it's kind of a bummer to sell something for less than it cost you to build it, which can happen if you're doing like a lot of machine learning in the cloud. That can be very expensive, and all of a sudden I'm charging $9.99 a month for you to use my thing. Well, it costs me $40 a month per user to run it. So you want profitable customer revenue. So then we're in the bootstrapped phase. Bootstrap, you put your boot on in the morning. I don't know why it's called bootstrap, strap, I don't understand. But basically it's your own money. And then you may actually get some money from your family or friends, or another magical creature called the angel investor. Like, I don't know. When you walk around, do you see angels? Like, why is a person with a check who wants a return, and it's really going to nag you for years after they give you that check? The smaller the check, the more nagging, right? So I always want like at least 50K, because then they don't need it. Like a 5K check, that could be problematic. Anyway, there's this term angel investor. It's really, really silly. There's this other term called high net worth investor, or this is even better than angel investor, sophisticated investor. Okay, so here in Australia, if you make a certain amount of money, I think it's up to 350K a year now, and you have a certain amount in assets, it used to be 2 million excluding your house. I think it's now 3.5 million excluding your house. Then they call you a sophisticated investor. Well, I tell you, I've met some high net worths that write checks from 25 to say 200K in startups, and they're no more sophisticated than, I don't know, your average tradie or whatnot. But it is a term. There's also these things called angel syndicates, and probably the most well-known at this point is called Aussie Angels, which takes a page out of the angel list book in the States. So an angel list, groups of angels get together and they fund startups in these little syndicates. And Aussie Angels was set up here a couple years ago to do that. We actually have Australia's best angel investment group here called Brisbane Angels. I don't particularly, like I said before, like being a VC, generally seems boring to me, and angel groups generally seem predatory, and you never want to rock up there and pitch for money. But so I go to Brisbane Angels and I sit there in the wild with them and I observe their behavior. And I have to say, it's pretty professional. They do write checks, so you're pitching. So they have dinner and drinks and they have a grand old time. It's a bit of a club thing. But they really are writing in checks. And one of the most important things is they have returns. So they invested in Go1, Clipchamp, others. And so they've been able to get money back, so they're a bit fluid, so they're actually making investments. So if you're at a startup and you're looking for early stage capital, we'll talk about pre-seed capital in a minute, Brisbane Angels would be a place to go pitch. And it's just right down the road here, pretty decent group. But be wary of other angel groups, Sydney Angels, Melbourne Angels, because a lot of the people in those groups, they've made their money in property or other things. They're not necessarily tech investors. They didn't necessarily make their money in tech. Oh, it's coming along. Like I've been here in Australia for 13 years. When I got off the plane 13 years ago in Sydney, I went around to visit venture capital firms. I went around looking for some startup founders, or like 3, and there's nothing going on. But in 13 years, it's really come along, and so you've got people that are making money on stock options at Go1 or at Tanda or even Tech1, Schedulo, places like that, cashing out, and then themselves becoming angel investors, if you will, use that term. We talk about funding rounds in terms, and I just want to make this really simple. Pre-seed, so it used to be seed and then professional. The first one was an A, the second one was a B, a C, a D, an E, and the amounts go up and the valuations go up. And then for whatever reason, because we like to just keep dividing things and making smaller units, this pre-seed thing has popped up in the last few years. So in your early days, the first money that you take in, usually in tranches of less than $1 million, is called pre-seed. Up to say $5 million is usually called seed. In Australia, anything over $5 million, $10 million in a round, it would be like a professional Series A. I didn't put this on here, but let's decode this as well. Pre-seed, I have either no revenue or a few $1,000s worth of revenue a month, pretty much nothing. So I'm pitching vision, and I'm pitching the ability for me. I'm selling the fact that I can drive traction, like I'm a great founder. Seed, you've definitely got some revenue. It looks like you've got product market fit in the horizon. Still less than 100K, say, a month, less than $1 million a year. The magic kind of ceiling you need to punch through for that first professional Series A round is like $1 million a year in revenue, or say 100K a month. And that's been that way. I mean, I've been at this for 30 years. It's been that way for 30 years. That number never ever changes for whatever reason. It's like $1 million is the golden magic number for you to be able to go talk to real professional investors that if they do things poorly, could get sued and go to jail and stuff like that. They're not investing their own money, they're investing other people's money. Okay, so who starts a tech startup? Well, hey, everybody in this audience could do that. I mean, literally, we are finding people maybe in a corporate job, somebody working at Tanda, maybe they have tech background, software background, somebody working at AWS, another startup maybe, they're working at Go1, and we're tapping them on the shoulder like, hey, what about you? You've learned how to do product, you've learned how to develop, you've learned how to sell something. When are you going to do your own thing? So we're looking for you, and that's why I reached out to Rian, and thankfully I was able to come and talk to you. Uni students. Now, I'm not really big on uni students as startups, right? Because when you first come out of uni, aside from like how to party and stay out late at night and hookups and stuff like that, and how to use Tinder, what else do you know? What is your domain expertise? I've got a uni student of my own at home, and I'm sorry, but if she started Facebook, that would be great. Those are snowflakes, right? Mark Zuckerberg, snowflake. Sergey and Larry at Google, snowflakes. It's amazing stories and all that, but that is not the norm. So we actually, the average age of the people in our current program is 39 and a half, and the program before it was 42. So people with a bit of domain expertise, a bit of maturity, maybe not so have their finances kind of settled. They know how to build something, get into this. I always think, so how do we evaluate whether these people have like founder DNA? I always think, like, are you persistently uncomfortable? Do you hate working for the man? Have you always wanted to do your own thing? Like, are you sitting in meetings day after day like, these people are numpties? I can so much do this better. Just give me the power. Then you should probably start your own thing. The thing about starting a tech startup, though, to be honest, it's really, really hard. I think I've got this on the next slide. I'm preempting myself, so we're going to get to that. So other aspects of founder, wildly ambitious. You want to build something global and a brand. You know, you're a bit arrogant enough to think that you could actually build something that would last, beyond your lifetime and maybe have some sort of a legacy. As I get older, I worry less about legacy and ego and all that other stuff. But hey, if you're like 39 and a half, you're still on into it. So that's good. And I think the best founders are problem-solving creativity addicts, right? It's like, I love to solve problems. Give me a puzzle, give me a maze. I'm just on it. Tell me I can't do something, I will prove you wrong. And those are the kind of traits that are going to sustain you doing this thing, because we're going to talk about what they don't tell you, what's not written on the tin. So I talk about people. I consider the minimum viable starting point. You got to have somebody that can sell something. This is really important. You've got to have somebody that can build something to be sold. And usually they're not in the same person, because the data shows us that a solo founder by themselves trying to do both of these things, that's just really, really hard. The chips are stacked against you. So like two people. An ounce of domain expertise, so really knowing a problem, a material problem, like we said, like $1 billion problem, $100 million revenue problem that you would know how to solve. So I would rate all of you cloud folks here to come up with some new data wrangling strategy, some sort of AI security model. Like those AI agents, they're just going to be running around there spending our money. They're going to be hacked by the Russians. What are we going to do with all that? The average software now has something like 45 different non-human identities. We got secret stores and all this stuff going on. It's a pet area that we've been looking at and thinking about recently. So if you're an AWS person, you're working on cloud, you would know something about that. I would rate your domain expertise. If you're like Alan in the security space and he came to me and said, hey, Stefan, I want to start a company and deal with AI agent security. I'm like, Alan, we should talk. Material problem to solve, as I said, and then a unique go-to-market strategy, some sort of insight, right? Because you're not going. So if you wanted to go into that space, and you're not going to be Okta or Auth0, who was acquired by Okta tomorrow, right? You're going to have to find a way to wedge in and grow, and like a cockroach, survive. And we'll get to why that's important in a second. So all that equals a solid starting point. Jump in. Oh, still not going to get to the really good punchline. One more slide. So pathways. There are some accelerators and incubators, and these terms they're just labels. They get thrown around. Some unis. So if anybody went to UQ, the UQ has their iLab program and their Momentum program. So if you are a alumni or affiliated with UQ, I think it actually take you even if you weren't at UQ these days. They're really good programs, and they'll teach you the ropes. So that you don't, let's say, if you don't teach you the ropes, what do? Fall off the bridge, the suspension bridge. They'll teach you the ropes so you go out on the suspension bridge and you don't just fall off into the chasm. That's it. Techstars is really famous. They run one in Sydney. StartMate, you may have heard of, runs in Sydney and Melbourne. But hey, why leave Brisbane? You've got Antler right here. We're at Fortitude Valley at the precinct. We're awesome. And some provide seed investment. Like our check now is like $250K, and then sometimes we invest at $500K, and then we'll follow on at A, B, and C. So by the end of the day, with some of these companies, hopefully Antler companies are successful, we'll have actually put millions of dollars of investment into them. And there's this thing called a venture studio, and we're probably more closely aligned with that model. We're like accelerator plus investment. Okay, cool. What's not on the tin? All right, this is my favorite slide. All right, I just told you how great it is. It's not that great. It's not that great. The first 3 years is really, really hard. Like, how would you like to not make any money? work 5 times harder than you ever worked. Really stress all of your personal relationships and family relationships, down to a knife's edge. But love what you're doing every day, because you're addicted to solving problems and you're creating something new that hasn't existed, net new, shiny. So if you like that kind of thing, if you actually think that you might like the grind, then this is definitely for you. If you think that you're going to start something and, I'll give you some classic snowflake examples. The guys that started YouTube, 10 months in, were acquired by Google for $1.69 billion. Hot damn, I want that, I'm in. The locals here, Leonardo AI, 20 months in, acquired by Canva for over $300 million. Hot damn, I want that. Almost nobody in this room will probably have one of those. So you really have to buy into the creativity, I think, and constantly being uncomfortable and wanting to put yourself out there. Having your family and friends support you is essential, so actually tell them what it's all about. Don't mislead them. Hey, it's going to be great. We're going to make a lot of money in a year or so. Hey, it's going to be a great lifestyle. Strong co-founder relationship is key. Because we run a program where we bring people together to be co-founders, we spend a lot of time on this. We have tools to help people figure out, like in a very short amount of time, whether they trust each other, could go into business with each other, have values aligned. They want to build a big company over time. They want to build a small company and exit quick. Roller coaster, very little money. All these bullets should just say very little money. First 3 years are a lesson in survival. Getting rich as possible. A life-changing exit is typically like plus 7 years. The data shows that to build the value for a life-changing exit, not in the case of YouTube, not in the case of Leonardo AI, but it's usually about 7-8 years. Yes, you have to love the creativity, the grind, and the art of the possible, and be comfortable with the unknown. That sounds great. It's like you're on one of those survivor islands all the time. Cool, that's me. That QR code just goes to my my LinkedIn or whatever. I'd be happy to talk to anybody. You ping me, we'll get a Calendly going, we'll talk about it. Yeah, I'm around, I'm local, I live on Bribey Island. And my greatest achievement today was, I'll just end with this is great. I woke up this morning and there was an injured bat in a tree in my backyard, right? I'm from America. I'm sure we have bats, but you don't see bats. What do you do? What do you do? Something like Google. I use Perplexity now. Forget Google search, it's useless. I use Perplexity now. Hey, Perplexity, what do I do with a bat in my backyard? It's like, you need to call the bat hotline. Did you know that Queensland has a bat hotline? So you call the bat hotline and say, hi. And Kathy answers, hi, this is Kathy. Hi, Kathy, this is Stefan. I think I've got an injured bat in your yard, in my yard. Not in your yard, of course you would know, but no, in my yard. And she says, oh, well, if you see a bat by itself during the day, that's a problem. It's injured. I'm like, well, why? Because bats want to go hang out with other bats. If you see them in the daytime, there's something going on. I'm like, well, can you help me out? Just look at the database. Where are you at? You're in Banksia Beach, 4507. Oh, yeah, Richard. He's about 5 kilometers away in Ningi. Give me 5 minutes. Hold. Calls up Richard. Richard, yeah, he's going to be there in about 20 minutes to pick up the bat. This is cool. So this retired guy shows up fully branded with a bat, I save bat shirt, I save bat hat with a pool skimmer net. And he goes in the backyard, climbs up the what do you call it, a ladder. And he's trying to get this bat, And lo and behold, the bat falls out of the tree, lands on his back. I've got this old guy on the top of a ladder. I'm holding the ladder. He's going, no, there's a bat on my back. There's a bat. Scamper down, falls over. Bat falls into the canal. And he's like, holy shit, the bat's going to drown. Get the bat. Jump and get the bat. Like, no, I'm not going in the water. There's sharks in the water. Shark might get the bat. Okay, let's get the pool net. Get the little flying fox. Put it in the little crate. It looks up at these eyes. They're just like cat eyes or dog eyes. Like, thank you, Stefan. I love you. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Stefan. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right, what's new? So, this is the What's New segment. It's essentially just covering the announcements since last meetup. It's not all of them, it's a selection. I blatantly just went through and picked the ones I thought were kind of interesting because we don't got time for all of them. Right, so just to dive in real quick, business applications, news from this morning. We are end-of-lifing Chime. Those of you that know. Those of you that don't, nothing changes because it turns out not a lot of people were using it. So in 2026, we will be ending Chime as it stands now, as a video conferencing chat application. The SDK for that will still be available, but we'll be working with customers to pivot and change all of that. One of the biggest users is Amazon internally. We have been using it for many, many years. Right, onto databases. DMS serverless now helps do some pre-migration assessments of the thing you're trying to migrate. This is nice in the fact that if you are doing migrations, it's going to tell you a bit more if it's going to fail before you actually start trying to do it. So definitely one of those things which is a nice to have. And DMS, being our database migration service, just helps do that full database migration or just ongoing migrations from point to point. Right, Postgres 0ETL integration with Redshift is really, really nice. It effectively means you don't have to spin up any extract, transform, and load processes between your Aurora database and Redshift. We will now just handle all of that for you. It is effectively EL. We extract and load on your behalf. And then if you want to transform, you can transform later. This release essentially makes it available in every region where Redshift is. Previously it was announced, but it was in limited regions. Now it's available in most places. Moving on, CloudWatch now captures execution plans for our Aurora Postgres databases. This is really, really nice. It's a good way of exposing those execution plans for your relational databases and having that captured and potentially saved for a longer period of time so you can access those. All right, on to some security and compliance side of things. I included this one because we have dropped the price for Guard Duty malware protection for S3 by 85%. That to me is a pretty decent cost saving for you guys doing no work at all. So if you're looking for antivirus malware protection on S3, this is definitely something to look at, turn on. It's almost a no-brainer for a lot of things, especially with this price reduction. Right, onto networking, content, and delivery. CloudTrail network activity events for VPC endpoints is now available. What this means is that we can now log into your CloudTrail all the network activity that hits a VPC endpoint. Previously, when you're doing data out to a VPC endpoint, which could hit S3 or it could go to any of the AWS services that you could deploy an endpoint in your VPC, no one was logging that. You could do VPC flow logs, you could kind of follow it along, but now we actually can log that to CloudTrail to your audit log and you can see the events as they're happening. The caveat I'll put on that is please be aware of what the pricing structure is for that. It lines with the data events for S3. So every time there's a network event, every 10,000 of those is a billable chunk of money, right? Nothing is more chatty than a network connection, especially to S3 or something along those lines. If you have a use case for it, it's amazing. If you don't have a use case for it, probably don't turn it on. I will watch my customers for their price going up if they turn that on. So network load balancer now supports removing availability zones. Probably didn't realize before, but if you had a network load balancer, you could only add availability zones. You could never actually remove availability zones from those network load balancers. You probably never had to do that. Some people did. They had to delete and recreate. Right? Now we have a way of removing availability zones and reducing that. Right? Turns out scaling in on those sort of things is a lot harder than scaling out and just adding extra. So we have some prescriptive guidance on how to do that safely and how to approach that. All right, moving on to compute. We're not going to dive too deep into all of the compute announcements and Gravitons being available in Melbourne and things like that. Lambda has now got some application performance monitoring for Java and .NET and the application signals. This is CloudFront again. Oh, no, sorry, not CloudFront, CloudWatch. EC2 now supports automated recovery using VSS, so your volume snapshot service, Windows technology. So your SQL Server databases running on EC2 can now use that to help restore. Before, there was a little bit of a gap around how you do that. But this really helps getting consistent snapshots and storage and the recovery for those kind of things. Dig into the announcement, the blog posts for details on how to actually do that, if that's you. Onto developer tools, we can now refactor CloudFormation stacks. I personally haven't had a chance to dive in and do this, but you can now essentially reorganize resources between CloudFormation stacks, say split them apart, and move resources around once they're actually deployed by CloudFormation, short of divorcing them from a stack and then having to import values and do a whole bunch of work. So if you're in the world where you've got resources deployed and you need to shift them around, it is now a doable thing. I'm not sure how you then take that and translate that back into your infrastructure as code pipelines and bring that back in. There's probably something to watch in that space, but definitely a cool capability for working in those brownfield estates, right? Not everything's a greenfield deployment. Right, yes, it is a developer tool. Amazon Q Developer now troubleshoots the AWS console and any events that happen in all the different regions. So if you have Amazon Q Developer licenses and you are in the console, it will now look at any errors that you hit and it will help you troubleshoot, diagnose, and drill down to what the actual root cause of those things were. This is actually really, really nice and definitely something to have a look at. In terms of Q Developer as well, we have the transform capability, which allows you to move up Java versions from like JDK 8 to JDK 17. We now support up to JDK 21, right? So it's just helping customers modernize and upgrade their Java stacks. In terms of Q Developer Agent, it can now build and run the tests for you while it's building out new features and capabilities and things like that as well. That's what that one is. On the front end, web and mobile, this is kind of that zone. We have Amplify Hosting. Amplify Hosting is our way of doing a lot of that front end development in a very structured methodology and approach. Obviously using the services like S3 and CloudFront and WAF and the like. What we've added here today is really just IAM roles for server-side rendered applications. So if you're deploying something like Next.js and you have server-side components as part of that application, having the IAM roles for that to be able to reach back into databases and do different tasks and have granular IAM permissions is actually quite nice. So Amplify has added the capability to do that. In terms of AI, we have Claude 3.5 Sonnet v2 now available in the Sydney region as well. So it's one of those ones which has been on the to-do list, I guess, for a while now. It's just an incremental improvement for the model availability. I know a lot of customers have been waiting for that to become available in the space. In terms of storage, not a lot of news. I talked a lot about this at the recap event we did a few weeks back, but S3 metadata is now generally available. So there's a service inside S3 which will help capture the metadata. So you can enable metadata on your S3 buckets, which is effectively the metadata for all of the objects in that bucket. And you can store those in Amazon S3 metadata, which in turn uses Apache Iceberg under the hood for all the storage. It's of interest because it integrates with a lot of the wider ecosystem of the data analytics tooling. But what you can do is, say you wanted to list all the objects that exist in a bucket, but you didn't want to give someone access to the bucket and the contents, but you. By turning on the metadata, we can effectively get a big list of the inventory of what's in the bucket, what exists, what doesn't exist, the size of them, when they were updated, all of that kind of stuff into the metadata, and you can grant access just to the metadata. So you can really cut down access paths, permissions, and use cases there. By using a service like this. That's pretty much all I have in the what's new announcements. I'm not sure. Yeah. All good?
Perfect. Thank you, Mark.
Cool. Oh, thank you. Right, so as the slide says, my name is Mark Promnitz. I'm a senior solutions architect here in the Brisbane office. I tend to work on one of the other floors, but we're here in the building and we're around in the community. I was approached by the organizing team, I think it was last week, saying, hey, our speaker fell through and we've got a slot. Can you pull something together? I said, yes, I've got a whole week. That'll be no problems at all. Then I promptly got sick. I was out for 4.5 days. Came back and went, still need to present. So looking at the theme for the night and what Stefan was covering, I was like, right, what can I do that's in the SaaS and the startup space? What kind of content can I pull from the areas around? And this is a repurposed, cut down version of a reInvent talk. So if you go looking for this, you will see the true, honest, and probably better talk on YouTube right now. And it's a repeating event that they've done in 2023, 2024, and there's a lot of good. So if you like the kind of content, but you want to hear it from the guys that actually do this in the SaaS factory team for AWS globally, go watch those talks. I hope Bill does not see me presenting this, because I don't feel like I'll do it justice. But let me give it a go. All right, so when we're talking about SaaS, we always talk about the promise of SaaS. And the promise of SaaS is not just a technical promise, but it's the business promise, right? We want agility and we want flexibility. We want to be able to innovate and deploy our code and have that automatically update for customers and available. We want to do that rapid innovation and potentially release quite frequently, have evergreen technology stacks and not be deploying version 1.2.3.5 underscore this one. We want to have good operational efficiency so that when we're actually deploying these out, it's one version of the code base. It's nice and green. It's really easy to deploy for all of our customers and hopefully manage that at scale. We want to have sustainable growth. So not just growth for growth's sake, but profitable growth as we're rolling through. And last but not least, we want it to be cost effective. This is the promise of SaaS. The challenge is, with all good intents, there's always the realities of what early stage startups go through. There's always the pressures coming in from the business around new feature development. There's challenges around customers wanting certain things. There's challenges around regulatory compliance. There's challenges galore. And this is probably why Stefan was saying it's not all roses. Right? So when we start going, okay, well, what are some of the pitfalls that we hit when we're talking SaaS? We look at things like, we have lack of customer profiles. We haven't spent the time of going, who's actually going to use this technology stack? What are their requirements? What are their regulatory requirements? And before you know it, someone's knocking on the door going, how much is it going to cost for us to implement HIPAA compliance? How much is it going to cost for us to do PCI DSS? And then it's suddenly an engineering back of the network going, it's probably this long. We see customers with not committed to a single version of their code base. They make customizations or forks based on dependencies, and we have snowflake environments that spin up. That one big customer, their first 10 customers, always the most important. To keep them happy, to retain that customer, sure, we'll bend. We don't really want to, but we'll implement this feature for them, and it'll be in their environment, and that's cool. No one else will have it. And then before you know it, you have 10, 20, 50 of these things, and life's not always fun. Sometimes you're unable to invest in automation and you end up filling gaps with people and teams. And yes, as you're growing and you got more customers, you scale up the customer success and the support teams to handle that. But it's one of those pitfalls that customers tend to hit recurringly. Not targeting growth and just adding features and not having an actual growth plan and a strategy, also one of those pitfalls. And also another one is really around just focusing on the AWS bill and how does that work. So they're the kind of pitfalls we're going to be covering today. The first one being pretty much deployments. And when we talk about deployments, this one is thinking about deployments as a one-way door. So when we talk about a deployment, it's like, okay, what's a deployment for a customer? And the one-way door concept is something we talk about a lot inside Amazon. It's one of the mechanisms we talk about as to, can we only go through this as a decision-making mechanism? Can we go through this, when we're making a decision, is it one we can go through only once? Like, once we go through the door, we're committed, we can't go back? Or is it a two-way decision where you can actually reverse that change and go back? So the challenge that customers often face is that they make this decision early days, and they make okay, cool, customers probably don't want to share resources with each other. The easiest way to do that is to set up a siloed approach where no one shares anything and they're all separate, and we have clear isolation strategy and everything's really nice. So you hear stories from customers like this one. We've got great enterprise customers, but we can't change what we're doing. We're finding it really hard to introduce new pricing strategies, to move down market, to target new customers, have different plans and the like. Because as soon as we do that, we potentially alienate other customers. And how do we manage and guide customers to move up to our enterprise plan or not, right? And how do they work from that? So this often starts as a one-size-fits-all mindset. And this can be fine. This technology stack's perfectly legitimate, right? We have an EKS cluster, we have product, order, catalog, containers that are running. They've got a database for persistence. They've got an open search service there, which is great for search, right? Put some data in there. We can full text search across it. It's perfectly viable. Tenant 1's great. Then we add tenant 2. And then they have their own environment as well. And we just go in full carbon copy across. Great, that's all right. You might see the word tenant there. If you're not familiar with the wording tenant, customer, pretty much interchangeable from the SaaS perspective. We like using the word tenant because it helps work out who's the customer and who's the tenant, and tenants can mean different things. You can have internal tenants, like internal dev teams might have an environment where they're operating and they're running and doing things. And then people go, well, but they're not a customer, right? So tenant nicely fits, and you get the gist. And in this diagram, we can route to each of those different environments using DNS. You got tenant 1 dot example, tenant 2 dot example. And as we add on more and more customers, we have more and more of these environments. The challenge with this is often it's a linear cost profile, right? As you add more and more of these environments, you're just stamping these out, which is not bad. But for some environments, well, for the customer example, which they gave at reInvent, the OpenSearch serverless started adding up a lot in AWS costs. And they looked at that and went, right, how can we solve this? How can we scale better? Not everyone's a big customer that needs their own environment. How do we handle that? And where do we start? So the place we tend to start is looking at those data patterns. Something like, hey, can we actually pull the OpenSearch service out of that carbon copy stamp and potentially share that? If there's no hard regulatory or compliance stance, you can look to move that out and potentially just have an index per customer, per tenant, and pool that resourcing so that you can reuse that compute and still achieve the same thing. Then we can go down to, okay, well, there's a standard tier as well. So how do we start building these things out? As he was building out the deck in the reInvent talk, we dived into the different types of tiers and how they're starting to build out the tiers within the SaaS offering, right? So inside the advanced tier, they might still have a full database dedicated compute for that tenant. Under the standard tier, you may look to also move out, say like that Aurora database, and have that shared as well, and potentially have a database per tenant as you're going through. So really looking for those opportunities to pool those resources, do all of that. It's not a perfect magic fix, because as soon as you have multiple tenants potentially operating on that same resource, you have noisy neighbor contention and you have different resource issues that can pop up, right? And we do need to work through that. We can talk about that in a bit. And then for this last one here, the optimization they made for the basic tier, potentially your free tier that you're offering to customers, was to go, okay, how can we break down even those services that are sitting in EKS? Potentially you could move to namespace isolation, not just cluster isolation, and use the namespaces within EKS to do that. It really means that you can start packing in more of those containers, more of those pods onto the same compute and share that environment more holistically. So looking for the data patterns and what you can do really helps drive down that operational cost of having to maintain a database and an OpenSearch per customer. but it also helps reduce that operational cost, right, of running those resources. You can also look at those microservices that are running, say like the product, the order. On the previous page, we had catalog. In this one, we looked at it and went, well, this is actually potentially a static catalog, which is the same for all customers. Why are we repeating it for every tenant? So what they looked to do was pull that out into its own microservice or environment, which is a pooled workload so that customers can then all reference that centralized API gateway, Lambda, DynamoDB, whatever the tech makeup of that is, and pull that out. So you're not repeating that over and over and having to keep it in sync. It becomes a referenced piece. So really we're looking at that workload decomposition and how do we break those things apart so that they're not just one big repeatable deployment. Right, the next pitfall is effectively assuming that all of your tenants are the same. I almost guarantee you that your tenants, if you have one of these environments, are not all the same. You will have small customers, you'll have larger customers. Some customers may have 10 users, some customers may have 1,000 users. So the customers with 10 users might have more data than the customer with 1,000 users, right? It really comes down to the usage patterns and how people are using your SaaS platform and things like that. So the example, again, through the talk was around events, right? Customers do wild things all the time on their own schedules around, oh, we're onboarding all these customers, or we're ingesting all this data, or running these reports, or hey, end of day, we suddenly do all of our business processing because we're a bank and we like doing that. So that noise and that neighbor, if you're operating in a shared environment, in a SaaS environment, can impact the experience of other customers on the platform. And everyone has a bad day at that point. So how do we look at solving for that noisy neighbor problem? We can look at multiple different parts of the stack. We can look at, say, the front end, API gateway. We can go, cool, how do we protect from spikes and things within an API gateway at the front? How do we look at our compute layer for things like this? This is a Lambda function. So maybe because of our traffic spike, we've used up all of our provision concurrency and now we have cold starts. Or maybe it's an EC2 fleet and you suddenly have to scale up and there's a latency times before things are available, right? We'd have to look at, okay, how do we handle the load and that kind of thing. And then there's databases. So if we've got multiple databases and a database per tenant in a shared system, how do we handle that? We don't just have to look at load, we could look at database size. Maybe some of them have a lot of data. Some of them might have bigger indices. There might be a whole bunch of index management that's running on it. And because it's a shared database environment, a pooled instance, they're all sharing memory on that box, right? So who gets priority usage of the compute sitting there? It is a challenge. The biggest challenge, though, I think, when you're looking at a shared environment like that is working out who's doing what. Like, where do you even start knowing who's the problem child? We all love our tenants, we all love our customers, but who's causing this, right? How do we help solve it? So the first part really is, how do we get those signals? And part of that is going, hey, look, okay, let's take our stack that we had on the previous slide and look at how do we expose logs or metrics along the lines which inject that tenant identifier all the way through. So things like API gateway can push logs out which have the tenant identifier in it. So does the Lambda function. Everything needs to log it up, and at that point, it could be CloudWatch, could be whatever log aggregation service you feel like using. They all do the same similar kind of thing. But the end result is you want to get some CloudWatch metrics or some insights out of that and effectively drive to group by tenant identifier and come up with something like this. So that you end up with a view saying, hey, okay, based on all the requests flowing through this service, tenant 2 is by far doing the most requests. So you can make inferences around, okay, well, if we move tenant 2 from the equation, would everyone else have a nicer experience, right? And at that point, you can start going, well, maybe tenant 2 needs to move up to the premium plan so that they can be on dedicated infrastructure in the silo and make those choices. But without having those signals and that information being logged and recorded, it's really hard to have the data to back up that point of view, right? Yes, you can create alarms based off those things as well. But in terms of aligning tenant infrastructure to the usage, effectively we end up in a world like this, right? Yes, we can put usage plans and throttling on the front doors for the API gateway. We can do provision concurrency for the Lambda functions and keep that going. And we can have the database. And as you see, look, we picked on tenant 2. They were doing the load. We shifted them to the advanced tier. And they're running in their own environment now, right? They're effectively siloed. Interestingly, though, we've deployed the exact same architecture for the standard tier as the advanced tier. A multi-tenanted environment, if you only deploy it with one tenant in it, is a single tenanted environment, right? It's effectively a silo. So in terms of the operational overhead and the deployment, it is just another punch out of that same architecture that you're doing. And you've effectively sharded your tenants at this point. So if tenant 2 is having a bad day and they're using it a lot, you shouldn't be impacting tenant 1, tenant 3. Equally, if tenant 1 having a bad day, tenant 3 might feel the impact, right? Because you're still using shared systems and the like there. Okay, pitfall number 3 is not prioritizing unit costs and really focusing on, hey, our AWS spend is just going up and up and up. Why is this? Like, what is this report? Every month we get a bill. It's different. Our revenue's not really increasing or anything. Like, what's going on? Please, that whole please explain moment. So when you dive into it, you start looking, okay, what does good look like? And how do we explain this? And how do we get to a point where we can share that, yes, we're working hard, we're implementing all the features, we're sustaining growth for our SaaS businesses by onboarding new customers, we're getting more and more customers on, and that's the whole growth trajectory, which is what drives revenue. But it's really hard to do growth and onboard customers and all of that while reducing costs, right? Those two things are almost opposing to each other. You can always optimize your environment and do a cost optimization and things, and by far and away go do that, right? But it's a focus thing, and the easiest way to grow that is to kind of come up with common terminology that you can use across the business as to where you're at and how you're tracking and how the business is going. So what good looks like is, well, this is kind of the view that the CFO comes to you with, saying, hey, look, our total cost is just increasing over and over and over and over. And this is the landscape that we're kind of in. We've launched, we've been transforming, we're finding product market fit, and our revenue's taken a dip because we're pivoting, we're looking, we're trying to find where does this platform best fit. With the viewpoint being that, hey, cool, once we've got product market fit, our revenue should take off, we're onboarding a whole bunch of customers, our growth is expanding. And yes, our costs are increasing, but that's because we're doing infrastructure to support the new customers and the new revenue. The way to communicate this with customers is unit economics. And that's really pushing for what's the unit cost of running the system. So is that the cost per transaction running through the system? The cost per tenant is a very common one. So what's the cost per customer for us to run this and do this? And how do we find that out, right? The area of focus that we really encourage people to work on is how do you drive, not necessarily trying to reduce your AWS costs or your total costs of developers and everything over time, but how do you drive down that efficiency cost of it actually costs us less to operate over time as we're doing it. So as we're going, we're being more efficient, we're able to serve more customers for less effectively, right? And yes, the costs are going up, but that's because revenue and customer usage and everything's going up as well. So it really is that optimization piece. So looking at that, the cost we want to capture, like how do we capture the costs? How do we get a view on that? How do we start going, okay, how do we know what our unit economics are? The first thing we could do is with silos. With the siloed environments, we can tag things. Everyone here, I'm assuming, is well aware of our cost allocation tags, where you can tag resources and that will flow through into your AWS bill And you can then look at the bill and go, cool, these things that were tagged like this cost us that much. Fairly easy, clean to tag a tenant to that when you're doing the siloed model, especially if you go per account or whatever you're doing. Like, you can have some very clean separation there, but you also have that operational overhead of having everything siloed and off by itself. So then we start looking at, okay, well, tenant 2 is there as well, and it's in different silos, tenant 3. And then we've got shared resources, so you probably have an onboarding service, you have your tenant management service, identity. These are all the common things that operate for your SaaS platform. They need to be tagged and allocated as well. And then you end up with pooled resources, and this fundamentally is the biggest challenge as to how do we then do breakup and allocation of the resources where customers are in a shared environment and trying to work out and attribute usage to those different tenants to understand who's costing us the most to run. Where we recommend starting is very much doing coarse-grained consumption. So looking at capturing usage metrics and attributing those to tenants. A good example of that is looking at your congestion points or places where a lot of your traffic flows through. So say if you're routing all inbound traffic for an API gateway or an application load balancer or something like that, that's often a really good place to focus efforts on exposing that tenant identifier again into the logs. And that's effectively all this slide shows us, is as we go through the API gateway into the Lambda authorizer, which is the Lambda function which helps do authorization and the like, we can inject tenant context into the logs, put that into CloudWatch, and we can get the data through saying, hey, these tenants have used these many requests, right? And we can pull that out. Same thing with application load balancers. If you're doing DNS routing, you can use the path there, the DNS path to identify the tenant. And you can also use, say, /order to identify the route, so you can do the maths down the track using Athena and potentially pulling in the external tables to come up with a view on tenant usage. The benefit of doing this, right, is that oftentimes you can come up with a view of going, cool, we have 30 tenants, we can work out who's using the majority of them and attribute the amount of traffic to those tenants. And sometimes that's the level of detail that the business needs to be able to make those decisions. It's often a very lightweight way of augmenting your existing code base to get that information out. And yeah, can sometimes get to the level of granularity of this tenant's big, this tenant's small, maybe like your t-shirt sizings and the like, for the business to make the decisions. And sometimes that's all they'll ever need, in which case you can kind of stop. Past this point, we kind of get into fine-grained cost, and it gets harder, for lack of a better word. In terms of measuring fine-grained cost, it almost always means adding code to your application, emitting metrics. The example here uses the Power Tools library to emit some metrics. And it's effectively getting the metrics for how long does this task take or how much usage of DynamoDB, because when you query DynamoDB, you get the write capacity units and the read capacity units that you consume during that request. You could log those, and you can save all this data, and depending on what metrics you care about as a business to get a good profile of your load, you can emit all of these things. So you can emit those application metrics, like this person used this request, and the request went to the database, and it came back, and that whole process took 20 milliseconds. You can emit that event saying, hey, we queried the database, it took 20 seconds, that kind of deal. The power of emitting those events is that we can then, again, use our log aggregation services to query those over a time frame, group it by tenant, and kind of get a view as to the fine-grained costs. Now, with those logs that we're emitting and doing that, we can map those up to essentially our cost and usage reports. So the AWS billing data that goes through as you're incurring the bill, You can slurp those up alongside the logs that you're publishing, and using something like a Lambda function or a container, or that compute could be whatever you want it to be. The process there would go, cool, we're doing these many requests based on the costs incurred for those resources, because you can grab out the tags and the pieces that you need for that. You can come up with a view of saying, hey, look, let's store something like this, which it says, so on the 10th or the 14th of October, the AWS Lambda service was invoked this many times by this tenant for a cost of XYZ. And you can do it at a daily level, you could do it hourly, or whatever that makes sense for you, right? Daily is often fairly granular. And the purpose of pulling all of this together and actually doing this work means that you can push it to a service where your business users can actually see it. So something like QuickSight, we end up with the ability to graph the tables, and we can go, look, this is the usage patterns for your customers. This is the biggest consumers, this is the smallest consumers. If you're emitting events and features or logs around feature usage, you can start graphing, this is the amount of feature usage per tenant, and they're in this tier, and you can start making intelligent decisions around which features depend in which tiers, and how do we do all of those things. So the more we can expose around what our customers are doing or our tenants are doing within the SaaS app, the more we can start enabling our business and feeding that data back to them. This is effectively the message, right? The next pitfall really is just not doing DevOps. DevOps well, right? A lot of people have filled gaps with humans. And in terms of doing that, we talk about DevOps and we go, okay, well, we kind of know what CI/CD is for software deployments. We know how to do that fairly well as an industry these days, I would say. The challenge is often when it comes to onboarding a new tenant, we don't apply that same capability of automating and doing things to onboarding. Often that's a human, someone having to log in, go into the context, create a record in the database, do this, oh no, okay, we can't put them in that system because their load is expected to be too high. We need to put them over in this tenancy, and oh no, actually, they have to be in the US region, not in the Australian region, and it just becomes that slow onboarding, which is impactful for customers. And yes, they might be used to that, but it's not a good experience for anyone. So as we're talking about onboarding, right, it's effectively their own life cycle. We are good at doing our software releases. Ideally, you want to try and increase the frequency of doing that. But while you're going through the lifecycle and you're releasing code and you're doing that, you also have tenants onboarding to the system, ideally all the time. And every tenant that onboards distracts people from doing the other tasks. And you're like, so what we really want to push for here is how do we automate as much of the tenant onboarding and lifecycle management as we can. And we do that through a few different things. This is when we introduce the concept of that control plane. It's something we use a lot here behind the scenes, I guess more than anything, in Amazon, is the clear distinction between application plane and control plane. Now, control plane here, I won't dive into too much detail, but think of it as a single pane of glass for administering and looking at everything that's happening in your SaaS application. It's your way of looking at onboarding, it's your way of mapping the tenants, it's the way of managing what tier they're on, having admin users to have a global view as to what's going on. It also helps integrate customer usage into your billing system. So you can bill your customers, because kind of a critical part of a SaaS business is getting paid for people that are on there. So yeah, we have the control plane, and we have a whole talks track and space in there. We have a SaaS Builder Toolkit, which is an open source thing to go look at on GitHub now, which is effectively a reference implementation for building these components for you, so that you can just get going and actually kick off your SaaS. You still need to build your application, and that's effectively where your IP is, right? It's not really in any of this other piece. So just build out the bit which matters, try and bring in as much of the other as you can. But double clicking on that onboarding piece, really diving for repeatable onboarding practices is one of the things we want to do. So you build out something like an onboarding service. That could be Lambda functions as they posit here, or it could be step functions, or it could be whatever workflow orchestration tooling you would like to use. The effect being that once we've got a new tenant or someone signed a contract or put their credit card in or said, yes, please, to the free trial, that automated process will kick off. It'll create the users, it'll create the identity. It might pause waiting for customer input if they need to provide their SAML data or whatever it is, but the process is pretty much automated. And it's well worth the time to automate that earlier and just add on to it as you need to, than to try and retrospectively go, cool, what's the business process we've built around this, and unpick all the spreadsheets and the emails back and forth of trying to get things set up. So when you've got your onboarding service, it can do things like emit an event out to your application plane, could use something like EventBridge. There's a novel approach there. You know, the challenge with control plane and application plane is making sure that neither of them are dependent on each other, so that if there's an outage in the control plane, the application plane will keep running. So your customer environment keeps running. Breaking that up by sharing messages like just events between those two event buses is a really nice, clean way of just pushing messages or instructions back. So essentially saying, hey, Mr. Application Plane, please create a new user, and then having something inside the application plane doing that. All right. Automate the right things. So when you've got your SaaS application you're setting up, the things to automate is bootstrapping of the environments. How do we bootstrap the environments? Often falls into the software development lifecycle. Your tenant onboarding, so how do we configure users? How do we get the tenants going? How do we configure them into metering and billing? Making sure the details are posted to Stripe, so we've got our payment flows going and the like, right? Next, tenant users. How do we get tenants onboarded? How do we get tenants in there and operational? How do we do updates and releases to those environments? Again, the more environments you have, the more environments you need to do the releases to, and try and keep all of these in sync. Hence, a multi-tenanted view of the world is actually really nice because you have one environment to do the release to. You just have more noisy neighbor concerns and issues and stuff to do with. And then the part we don't like to talk about as much because it always means someone's leaving us, and that's a sad thing, is tenant offboarding. But surprisingly, or not surprisingly, this is often an overlooked part of the automation process as to how do we clean up resources, how do we remove that tenant-specific IAM role, how do we clean up the data that's sitting in S3. It's always a down the track, we'll get to that. And as you walk into some customer environments, you find a lot of this old legacy, we don't know anymore. Like, it could be cleaned up, but no one's got time to do that. We're too busy focused on implementing feature X over here. So spending the time to effectively automate the inverse of your onboarding as you're going through and just keep those things in sync is really nice. All right, pitfall number 5, tenant-specific customizations. This is probably the root of all evil for SaaS, is having per tenant customizations of your code base. So, it's often something that happens a lot though, in an early stage SaaS before you get big enough to be able to tell customers, no, it's on the roadmap. So as we're going through and we're looking at it, I'd like to consider everything, with tenant-specific changes being, technical debt. So for an example here, right, we have what's essentially like a release pipeline. So we've got code commit, code build, there's CloudFormation, and you deploy the application code, right? So for tenant 1, we might have version 1. We might choose to deploy EFS as the storage mechanism. Inside the infrastructure as code, it puts the EFS storage layer into the template. We deploy it out. Happy days. Tenant 2 comes along. They go, cool. We also want EFS. So we add that in there. You've got the build commands for EFS. And if you're writing this in application code, you say, cool. If it's tenant 1 or it's tenant 2, we want to do EFS. As we move along, we might have tenant 3 who goes, I want to use EFS in frequent access. So then we go through and we do different build commands, and we go, okay, well, if it's tenant 3, then we do, and we start building up this horrible logic chain as to which tenant should have different changes in different environments and the like. Tenant 4, though, all of a sudden wants to go to FSX cluster, and you end up with a whole nother piece, right? And these things just tend to snowball, and you end up with really easily end up with a whole bunch of different snowflakey kind of environments. It's all the same code. It's just small tweaks, small changes, and then it's the divergence and how do we bring that all back together again is the real challenge, right? The way we like to think about this is please, please, please use configuration over customization. So back to that whole one code base and just feature flag everything. Use some form of external configuration management to do that. You can use app config, that's our service that does a very similar thing to this. You could use launch darkly, you could use a whole number of services that do it. Just be aware that when you're picking that service, it is fundamentally becoming a critical part of your application. So you are attached to that service from then on out, right? If that service is not available, the feature flags can't be evaluated and your application's not gonna have a very nice day. So that's my one consideration when going down the feature flagging route is just think about the dependencies you're adding into your application because it will be in the critical path. That said, this is by far and away the best way of solving for this problem and turning features on for certain customers and features off for other customers. Hey, so if we got this new feature and say, hey, we really want to use that FSX for Luster in this customer, we can turn that feature on for tenant 3. And happy days when they go and they release because the feature flags check, they get that. The code base is all the same, everything's nice, and we're using an external feature flag to be able to do that. Now, we are able to extend that past just features into essentially the experiences. So we can look at the feature flags from a tiered perspective. So when you're on the advanced tier, you get these features. If you're on the basic tier, you get these ones. If you're on the free tier, you get nothing, pleb. And those kind of things. So when you're exposing that and you're sticking that into a feature flag driven kind of environment, it externalizes that a lot outside the code base. It means that your business users can potentially make those changes. One of the benefits of some of those feature flag SaaS providers, like the partners that are there, is very much that they like putting the control of releasing those features in the business user's hands. So you can tweak and tune and do a whole bunch in that space. So again, if we look at our pipeline before, we might be able to go to a trunk-based similar code version for everything, not multiple different versions or different branches within our Git repository. Be able to push through that pipeline, and based on pulling through that feature flag saying, hey, this tenant, this customer is in this tier, we deploy certain resources, right? And out they come. And again, if we were to put that into application code, it would be a whole bunch simpler because we're just going, if it's a feature flag, then do X, right? And that can just persist. Now, sometimes when you think of feature flags and you're using them as like release flags for your new software development, feature flags might be a short-lived concept that you'd have in your head. Like, okay, we're releasing a new feature, we want to just have it in there, and then once it's a live feature and it's good for everyone, we'll remove the feature flag so that it becomes an always-on capability. We're in two spaces for that. Still absolutely go do that, but if you want to have the ability to turn things on and off and adjust between tiers, leaving the feature flag there and thinking of it more as a long-term flag is a powerful concept. You can also use this to effectively cause chaos and experiment. Hey, look, if we're operating, this is our normal setup, what happens in the environment where if that feature just got turned off? Does the user experience still handle it? Does the UI still work? Does things work? Sorry. Yeah? No comment. And look, you can do things like blue-green test feature releases as well. So you can say for 10% of our customers, we want to have this feature flag turned on. So you can start showing and doing new things and introducing code changes a lot through these feature flags. So you can do a lot to get that done. Obviously, enterprise tier, everything's turned on, and you can iterate on your pricing, your performance, and the like. And I guess if you're turning features on and off, you can potentially adjust your pricing tiers in that way as well, right? Just by changing the feature flags as to what's available and what's not. All right, that's pretty much me from the talk. We kind of ran through deployment and automation. We covered that one. We talked about noisy neighbors and how to approach that. We talked through the cost pitfalls around focusing on just cost spend and trying to reduce that and not focusing on growth in those unit economics. If there's one thing there to talk to that I'd like everyone to lead with is from a technical point of view, if you can get to unit economics, that's the one thing which will resonate with your business users. And that's the CFO, that's your CEO. They're the guys that care about those numbers. Getting to that shared terminology when you're talking about costs is 100% the way to, explain and get things done and get that alignment between those, two very different worlds at times. Automate your onboarding, and please, please, please stop doing those customizations. That's me. Thank you all.
Okay, just a couple more things before I let you all go. And I'll turn the microphone back on again. Just a couple more things before you go. First of all, thank you, Mark. That was a great talk. Certainly is hitting home, making sure you decouple those services. Feature flags. It's a very underappreciated method of looking after your own SaaS applications. Thank you to our sponsors and supporters, AWS for looking after us tonight and putting a roof over our heads. ThoughtWorks for the pizza tonight, and Idea 11 for their support as always. Do you want to present at the group ever? You had some great ideas. Do it, yeah. You guys had some great ideas earlier about what you want to hear about, but also maybe some of you went, I can talk about that topic. Scan the QR code, reach out either on Slack or on LinkedIn. If you've got an idea, jump up. No matter what level of speaker you're at, this is where we encourage you to get involved, practice. Maybe you're a seasoned speaker and you've got something really important to talk about. Absolutely fantastic as well. Next month, we've actually got a speaker from Atlassian coming in to talk about something really cool and technical. We've got a YouTube channel. So each of these sessions now gets recorded. We put it on our YouTube channel. You can go back to this content. So if you missed Stefan's talk early today, and I know a couple of people did and they really wanted to see it, you can go back and watch that a little bit later. Scan the QR code and check out our YouTube channel. We also have a Slack group. I mentioned earlier, we're going to start doing jobs board, and I want you to start inputting your partners, your businesses, open roles into the jobs board. But first, to do that, jump on Slack. This is an open invite to our Slack workspace. We post about events. We've got an AWS outages channel, so you know when they happen. We have the latest community news and service announcements in there as well. Jump in and get involved.
Also, if you arrive after 6 and you hit one of those doors on the way in which don't open, probably the best way to reach us is via that Slack channel.
Yeah.
We'll make a channel. Help! And then the next user group is March the 20th. I did get that right, didn't I, Ryan?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Cool. I know we've got Atlassian coming to mention that earlier. I'm not sure who our second speaker is for that. It's probably Mark again. We'll give him 2 days' notice this time on purpose. But yes, make sure you register, scan the QR code as well. Lots of QR codes. I know it's the easiest way to get you guys information, but also don't forget to check out Slack for this information as well. And then lastly, thank you guys for being here tonight. I'm going to ask you for one more piece of feedback tonight, just one more piece, and that's to click on that QR code and give feedback about your experience tonight. Please be as constructive as you want, as positive as you want. We want to understand what it is that you want to see here, what it is you want to do, what is it you don't want to see. You don't want me on stage anymore? That's cool too. Want more of mine?
But this is how Alan and I keep employed, so please, thank you for the feedback.
But please, yeah, keep the feedback coming as well. That is what keeps these groups ticking. But otherwise, thank you very much for your time tonight. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next month.